If you learned that you were going to die tomorrow, what would you do? Knock some things off your bucket list? Spend some time with your family? Watch the rest of this topical video? The question, despite becoming a bit of a cliche, points towards something important. It reveals how our understanding of death and the resulting orientation towards it determines the way that we structure our lives. Martin Heidegger, renowned philosopher, took up these deathly matters while occupied with a different question in his best-known work, Being and Time. So, throughout this video, I'd like to explore Heidegger's philosophy of death and the philosophy of life informed by it through a close textual analysis before addressing a critique from French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. This is Heidegger Towards Death. Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher who wrote throughout the majority of the 20th century. His magnum opus, Being and Time, was published in 1927, a year before he took Husserl's seat at the University of Freiburg, and 6 years before he joined the Nazi Party. Despite the question concerning Heidegger's politics and philosophy being an important one, it won't be covered here. Instead, our focus will be on Being and Time, and, in particular, his discussion on being towards death that takes place at the beginning of Division 2. Some general knowledge will be needed before picking up the task of death in the middle of the book, so allow me to introduce just enough in order to make his discussion of death semi-intelligible. Heidegger's central concern throughout Being and Time is the question of the meaning of being. The history of philosophy has been occupied with questions about beings, says Heidegger. They ask, does a book exist? Does the color red exist? Does the number 1 exist? Yet each time they ask, they presuppose an understanding of what it is to exist, or to be. This is what Heidegger is interested in, not in beings, but in what being is. Capitalized, not to mark some ultimate being, but rather to distinguish it from plain old beings. Seeking an answer to the question of the meaning of being, Heidegger takes on a phenomenological approach, that is, based on experience rather than theory, and inspects Dasein, which is rendered as being there when translated. If anything will shed light on the meaning of being, it'll be the one asking the question, us. Dasein is not the biological human, nor the person as an individual, static thing, but the distinctive kind of entity that human beings, as such, are. As Dasein, things are meaningful to us. We have concern for ourselves, others, the world, and being itself. Thus, Dasein's state of being is care. While the conventional meaning is implied, Heidegger gives a more technical, or jargony, meaning to care that will come in handy later. Heidegger defines care and Dasein's state of being as ahead of itself, being already in the world, as being alongside entities encountered within the world. Divided into 3 temporal descriptions, these characteristics define that kind of entity that we are. First, Dasein is being in the world. None choose where they're born, who they're born to, when they were born, nor a number of defining attributes. Instead, we are thrown into this world, and our experience, where we find ourselves, who we find ourselves with, and when we find ourselves, is subsequently conditioned and limited. Second, Dasein is being alongside entities and others. We live in constant use of tools and things around us. We live alongside others, or with others, as the structures through which we attribute meaning are commonly those we adopt from others. Wherever we find ourselves, there are certain habitual and intellectual norms determined by the they, and invoked at times whenever it's said, that's just what one does, or that isn't what one does. Insofar as Dasein gives into these expectations, Dasein is fallen and adopts an unauthentic they-self. But we'll see an example of this shortly. Third and finally, Dasein is ahead of itself. We are constantly projecting, at all times, a number of possibilities lay before us. Only some of these possibilities will become actualities. But insofar as we are, some of those possibilities will become actualities. Thus, Dasein always has a number of possibilities, and although not an infinite number, they each shape what Dasein gives meaning and does. These 3 components make up the state of being of Dasein, yet as presented, they are all distinct. This is the challenge Heidegger faces at the beginning of Division 2. Dasein, as the questioner of the meaning of being, must be revealed if we are to have any luck at answering the question of the meaning of being. But as it is, Dasein has only been unconcealed in parts. So now, Heidegger would like to bring it all together and reveal the whole of Dasein. Thus, we begin Division 2 not with death in the mind, but on a quest for the whole of Dasein. Heidegger's existential analysis of Dasein up till now cannot lay claim to primordiality. To lay claim to primordiality first requires Dasein to be revealed as it is, as Dasein in its wholeness. But where is the whole of Dasein to be found? Well, as we'll see, it can be found in no other place than Dasein's end. But we need to start off with what we have thus far. Dasein's state of being, and that which forms the totality of Dasein's structural whole, is care. Having defined care earlier, we're aware that one characteristic of Dasein is that it's always ahead of itself. That is, Dasein's being includes projection, the multitudes of possibilities and actualities that Dasein is continually propelled towards. Dasein, as always ahead of itself, always has something still outstanding. Dasein, so long as it is, cannot be without possibilities, some of which are to be actualized. As I'm writing this video essay, it's still outstanding whether or not I'll finish it. Once I do, it'll still be outstanding whether or not I upload it. And once I do, it will still be outstanding whether or not I make another, and so on. There's still more that I'm to do. As long as Dasein is, it has possibilities. But so long as Dasein has possibilities, it is not yet whole. Hence, wholeness cannot be found in Dasein so long as it is. Conversely, no longer being there, in which Dasein has no more possibilities, is whole. Only in the end is wholeness found, but once in the end, Dasein is no longer. This poses a serious problem as to how to discover Dasein's wholeness through Heideggerian phenomenology. Where can we find this wholeness if it cannot be found in our own end? One answer that Heidegger entertains only to reject is in the experiencing of the death of others. The end of others appears at first to be objectively accessible as a shift of modes from being there to no longer being there. And this sounds exactly like what Heidegger was looking for. Yet, such an analysis doesn't satisfy Heidegger. Dasein, after its death, is not a lifeless material thing, like any rock, paperclip, or piece of paper. They are unalive. Alternatively, the deceased, who still remain behind in sorts, can still be the subject of concern and being with, despite being utterly incapable of reciprocating. Incapable of sharing the deaths of others, but rather experiencing it as a loss, the dying of others is not something which we experience in a genuine sense. At most, we are always just there alongside. Therefore, the experience of the death of another is not sufficient to uncover the wholeness of Dasein, because it tells nothing of Dasein's death, only those of others. But before entirely dismissing the experience of the death of others as a means to finding Dasein's wholeness, Heidegger refutes the argument that one could experience the death of another through representation. Theoretically, if I were to travel back in time to take Robespierre's place at the guillotine, I could die as his representative. In this case, I would die for Robespierre. But I wouldn't die for Robespierre. My life would be exchanged for his, but he wouldn't attain immortality. He would still face a death which is solely his, and which I, as an other, could have no effect on. What this describes is the first of three initial defining factors of the Heideggerian death. Heidegger explains, by its very essence, death is in every case mine, insofar as it is at all. And adjacent to this mineness of death is the refutation of dying as an empirical event. Instead, death is to be understood as an existential phenomenon, if Heidegger is to have any hope in making death have sense as the end of Dasein. Seeking things which have analogous wholeness in their ends through the phenomenological approach, Heidegger has a look in his kitchen. He considers the ripening of a fruit, which is of a similar kind of being of not yet, just like Dasein, but he finds one major difference. The ripeness that constitutes the not yet of the fruit is equivalent to the fruit's fulfillment. When the fruit ripens, it is fulfilled. Hence, the fruit goes towards ripening as fulfillment. Dasein goes towards death, but death is more often unfulfilling, as Dasein has ripened far earlier or not yet. In both cases, at Dasein's death, Dasein has fulfilled its course, but not fulfilled itself. Common conceptions of ending, like that of the fruit, the road, or the rain, are all incapable of explaining the ending of Dasein. They describe endings of inert objects, that which is without experience, concern, or projection. Seeing as the ending of that which we are with, others, and that which we are alongside, things, are both unable to explain the death of Dasein, Heidegger takes a leap. The ending which we have in view when we speak of death does not signify Dasein's being at an end, but a being towards the end of this entity. Death is a way to be, which Dasein takes over as soon as it is. As soon as man comes to life, he is at once old enough to die. This shift from being at an end to being towards the end holds hope for Heidegger's task of determining the totality of Dasein. Heidegger is quick to distinguish the existential death, the end of being in the world, from two other kinds of death. Perishing, originally introduced a couple of pages earlier, is that end which is faced by all living things, including animals and plants, while demise is the non-biological end, studied by the social and natural sciences. Both perishing and demise are secondary to the ontology of death as they presuppose it. Dying is also clearly defined as that way of being in which Dasein is towards its death. As mortal, Dasein is necessarily dying. Rather than some static thing, Dasein is continually projecting towards its own death, as an inevitable possibility. Heidegger quickly addresses topics of religious beliefs about death and the metaphysics of death. In both cases, he withholds any judgment. In his phenomenological approach, the reality post-death or otherworldly doesn't matter. It is beyond experience, and experience is the only ground on which Heidegger's analysis stands. But to both, Heidegger also states it to be necessary to recognize his ontological interpretation as presupposed and possessing of absolute precedence. Heidegger's analysis throughout being and time uncovers the primordial grounds on which our experience is built. As matters conditioned by our experience in this world, religious and metaphysical beliefs follow Heidegger's ontology. Next, Heidegger sets out to make sense of death as being towards the end in light of care, Dasein's basic state. As Dasein's basic state, care is ahead of itself, being already in the world, as being alongside entities encountered within the world, the three characteristics introduced earlier. Here, Heidegger places a test for death to measure up to. If indeed death belongs in a distinctive sense to the being of Dasein, then death must be defined in terms of these characteristics. Can death disclose all three attributes of care? Thrownness, fallenness, and projection? Before this question is addressed, Heidegger articulates the third characteristic of death. As he says, death is something distinctively impending. This status of being impending in general is not unique to death. There are plenty of impending things. My impending completion of this essay, the impending upload, and so on. Yet, death manages to stand before and stand out, as it is the possibility of the end, of no longer being able to be there. Death also cannot be outstripped by anything, since it is undeniably impending. There is no case in which death is not on Dasein. It can't be passed off onto any other. Neither can anything, be it practice or elixir, defeat death and guarantee immortality. Hence, Heidegger writes, death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Thus, death reveals itself as that possibility which is one's own most, which is non-relational, and which is not to be outstripped. With these features uncovered, we may return to ask the question, does Dasein satisfy the three characteristics of Heideggerian care? A short sketch of authentic being towards death may be given here so as to answer the question in the affirmative. Death is already the subject towards which one is ahead of themselves, that is, projection above. Death is also the target which every Dasein is thrown towards. Along with this thrownness comes factical knowledge or ignorance, and it is also from being thrown that death reveals the mood of anxiety, wherein one stands in the face of death. Finally, falling from the face of death, which results due to a feeling of uncanniness, the feeling of not being at home, is avoided by understanding the reality of death, as provided here by Heidegger. For these reasons, Heidegger answers the question of care saying, as regards its ontological possibility, dying is grounded in care. If being towards death is essential to Dasein, then average everydayness will demonstrate it in an inauthentic manner, and this is precisely what they do. Unlike facing the above existential depiction of death, average everydayness demonstrates an alternative being towards death. Their idle talk exhibits their understanding. They say, one of these days one will die too, in the end, but right now it has nothing to do with us. This suggests that the they don't take death as a threat, for death lies far off in the distance. Furthermore, it is not my death that is the subject of the rhetoric of the they. The they speaks of one's death. The they actively conceal the attributes just previously described of death, and then they go on to preach escape from death and return to tranquilized everydayness. And the they has dictated average everyday being towards death so well that it is already a matter of public acceptance that thinking about death is a cowardly fear, a sign of insecurity on the part of Dasein, and a somber way of fleeing the world. The they does not permit us the courage for anxiety in the face of death. The they alter the mood of anxiety into a loathed, cowardly fear, and then advise indifferent tranquility to quell that fear. This is the alienation of Dasein and is characteristic of falling, or fleeing in the face of death. Hence, although a poor being towards death, average everydayness does demonstrate Heidegger's prior analysis of death through exhibiting the three dimensions of care, each in an inauthentic way. The they takes their thrownness towards death as a matter of fear, as though one were to have a case of death. The they exhibits their state of being fallen by recognizing death as an impersonal, empirical phenomena, for which idle talk explains simply that one dies. And the they exhibits their inauthentic projection towards death through expectation, idly waiting around for death to arrive, as though it were an Uber Eats order. It is precisely the untroubled indifference which the they takes towards death that sets their treatment of it apart. But there is one thing that average everydayness managed to unintentionally disclose about death: the certainty of death. Only the certainty of death from the they was inauthentic, in that death was treated as an empirical phenomenon. However, death as being towards death isn't available as an empirical phenomenon. Instead, what the they had achieved certainty of was demise and perishing. They took death as demise and perishing and determined it to be certain, as if a statistic. Furthermore, the they claims that death is certain, while negating its immediate threat by suggesting death to be far off, saying, everyone dies, eventually. To do so, according to Heidegger, is contradictory, because it is death's very certainty that it is possible at any moment. Along with the certainty of death goes the indefiniteness of its when. When indefiniteness is concealed, so too is certainty. Certainty and indefiniteness combine together to be the last fundamental characteristic of the Heideggerian death. To return to Heidegger's original endeavor, Dasein's wholeness has now become available. Being a whole need not be found in demise, perishing, or being at an end. After the exploration of being towards death, Dasein has shown that its not yet is already included in its being. Thus, through being towards death, being a whole can be found. Before discussing authentic being towards death, I'd like to entertain one criticism, that criticism offered by Sartre. In Being and Nothingness, the mid-20th century existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre mounts a critique of Heidegger's being towards death. For some context, Sartre argued that all people had the freedom to make their own choices along with the responsibility not to forget it through conforming to social expectations. To Sartre, Heidegger appears as the philosophical form of a broader trend intended on the humanization of death, disarming death from its default status as the wall of life. In particular, Sartre criticizes Heidegger's interiorization of death as something that is, in every case, mine. Doing this is a sleight of hand because, for Sartre, death is neither mine nor a possibility. He writes, "Death is not my possibility of no longer realizing a presence in the world, but rather an always possible annihilation of my possibilities which is outside of my possibilities." Rather than a possibility itself, death is annihilation, wherein all possibilities are revoked. Furthermore, death cannot be my own because, through death, one loses control of themselves and hands it off to the other. Sartre himself is no longer able to determine his existence. Instead, he lives on in the perceptions and judgments of the living, who now have full control over who Sartre was. If this critique is to hold, not only does Heidegger's account of being towards death fall through, but so do the foundations for the answer to the question of the meaning of being. So what might be Heidegger's response? It would appear to me that Heidegger would make the argument that Sartre misunderstood the death spoken about by Heidegger, and even confused it for that which Heidegger termed demise. Thus, a Heideggerian response may attack the basis on which Sartre's argument stands, his understanding of the Heideggerian death. The primary distinction can be noted between Sartre's re-evaluation of the possibility that is death. To place them face to face, Heidegger said, "Death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein," while Sartre revises it to be, "Death is an always possible annihilation of my possibilities, which is outside of my possibilities." Death, for Sartre, stands outside of one's possibilities as annihilation. But for Heidegger, death is not an event first, and therefore a possibility sometime down the road. In fact, death isn't even an event. It is precisely the possibility of no longer being able to be there. Demise is the event at which the human being's life ceases. But death is a way to be, and that way of being that Dasein as mortal always is. Hence why, as we'll see, authentic dying is a way of living, not reserved for the moments of one's death, as Sartre himself suggested. Average everyday being towards death was inauthentic in its evasion from the face of death. As Dasein is, most commonly, average everydayness, it tends also to be inauthentic being towards death. Yet, this isn't absolutely unchangeable. Authentic being towards death can be found in the disclosing of how death truly is, and then the facing of that with anxiety and all. To be authentic, one must recognize death as having the attributes Heidegger has unconcealed from it, and then to comport themselves towards it in such a way that they don't flee from it. This isn't to be confused with the actualization of death, like in suicide. Death for Heidegger is chiefly a possibility. To hasten your death is to deprive yourself of the very grounding that being towards death is. Nor is authentic being towards death analogous with dwelling on death, as in thinking about it and calculating its arrival, and nor is it to be found in the expecting of death. To do so would be to take death out of the possible and wait for it as an actual, thereby revoking death of its genuine characteristics. Rather than actualizing it, dwelling on it, or expecting it, Heidegger suggests that authentic being towards death is to run ahead towards death. Translated less literally, running ahead is anticipation, wherein one faces death as the possibility that it is, with its fivefold characteristics, rather than as it is told by the they. Each characteristic of death that Dasein comports itself towards informs a shift in Dasein's orientation in life. First, acknowledging death as your own most possibility reveals how your death is entirely on you. Others, despite their talk, can't face death for you. To realize this is to be wrenched from the they, and to subsequently realize everyday Dasein's lostness in the understandings and habits of the they. The second, acknowledging death as non-relational, individualizes Dasein down to itself. Not only can others not face your own death for you, everything, others and the world, fail you in death. Having realized Dasein's lostness, the non-relationality of death forces you to direct yourself towards your own most possibility individually, rejecting the possibilities suggested by the they-self. Third, acknowledging death as that possibility which is not to be outstripped dispels any worry that Dasein might be outstripped by others. Death is the ultimate possibility, the possibility of absolute impossibility. Seeing this, all other possibilities are lit up, disclosed by that possibility which is inescapable. There is nothing beyond the end. Seeing this is to account for the whole of Dasein, and for the totality of your possibilities. Fourth, acknowledging death as certain reveals death to be something other than an empirical event or statistic. Death turns out to be primordially certain, accounted for in the most primordial whole of Dasein. I, or consciousness, stand atop this primordial totality of Dasein as mortal. Being towards death precedes and frames all conceptions and abstractions. Thus, to anticipate death is to see beyond the shallow fictions offered by the they-self, and to reach for a more fundamental, primordial reality. Fifth, and finally, acknowledging death as indefinite with regards to its when reveals the constant threat of the end which looms over you. The when of death is unknown, it could be far off or it could be soon. You are always at risk, whether in a car, at a restaurant, or at home on the couch. The resulting state of mind when you stand face to face with death rather than fleeing from it is anxiety, and only through this anxiety is there any self-understanding, as Dasein finally understands itself as mortal, and as being towards death. Only in finding comfort in a cowardly fear of death espoused by the they does one avoid this. To run towards this anxiety is the only way for Dasein to be authentic being towards death, to live your life in a way that is your own, that reveals the whole of your possibilities, that reaches the primordial, and that rejects conventional promises of security. Heidegger concludes his discussion of being towards death, summarizing, anticipation reveals to Dasein its lostness in the they-self, and brings it face to face with the possibility of being itself, primarily unsupported by concernful solicitude, but of being itself rather in an impassioned freedom towards death, a freedom which has been released from the illusions of the they, and which is factical, certain of itself, and anxious. He had been dying for the 86 years prior, but on the 26th of May in 1976, Martin Heidegger perished from an unidentified infection. Now we stand being alongside his thought of being towards death, and we can return to the question I presented at the very beginning to see how it measures up. What would you do if you learned that you were going to die tomorrow? Without any long-term interests or social expectations, your answer displays a freedom towards death of sorts. You become free to do exactly what you care about the most, hence it shares the ownmostness of Heideggerian death. Yet I think Heidegger would find the question ultimately unsatisfactory. By setting a date for the death, there's room for comfort in a determined when. You could plan out your last day doing what you want to do the most, and then graciously meet death once the clock strikes 0. But this is nothing like reality, because in reality, death is possible at any moment. To play it off as otherwise is to flee from the face of death, to hide inside away from uncanniness, and to return to the tranquility of the they-self that alienates Dasein. Thus, one could imagine Heidegger posing a better question. What would you do if, instead of hiding in fear and shying away from it, you embraced the anxiety of your own mortality and lived, running ahead towards death? That's all I've got to talk about today. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe, and if not, or you thought I got anything wrong, please let me know what and why down below. And until next time.